have periodic meetings where you can check if you're doing it right or get some help on the more complicated pieces. That is also something that we help with. I see a message in the chat mentioning that not everyone sees the screen share. Typically, if it's only a few people who don't see the screen share, it's typically an issue with Zoom on your side. In that scenario, the best thing you can do is close Zoom and rejoin. Okay, good. All right, so let's jump into today's topic. Again, I'm going to sort of breeze through a bit of information on development environments, because while it's not the main topic for today, it is a prerequisite for writing PHP code. And the topic today is PHP, but we are covering it in a Drupal-centric way. Let's see, so again, I see a message in the chat about not hearing anything. That should be an issue on your end. So check if your audio is working. There's a number of issues that could go wrong with the audio, but hopefully it's as simple as the volume being off. Okay, so let me proceed here. Again, we're covering this from a Drupal-centric standpoint. And when doing Drupal development, you need to have a web server. Typically, that would be Apache, Nginx, or both. The web server is responsible for taking visitors who request a page on your website and routing them to the appropriate file. You would also need, for Drupal, a relational database typically, so MySQL, MariaDB, or something similar. That's where the content for your site is stored, such as the blog posts. And finally, you need PHP to be installed. Nowadays, you probably want PHP 7.3 or above, but you need PHP to be installed on the server so that the PHP code you run can be interpreted and processed into a web page. Now, you do have the option of installing those independently. And that's one of the options for local development. But there are a couple of packaged options which make the process move a little faster and make it a little easier and more repeatable. So local development refers to running PHP and Drupal on your computer, as opposed to on the internet. Let's see, so when you're doing local development, the upside is you typically can work without an internet connection because the whole website and PHP and everything is running on your computer. I'm not spending a lot of time on the pros and cons because the main topic is PHP and I'm looking to get to the main topic. But just to show you, there are a couple of options. You can use a virtual environment with Vagrant. This is sort of a heavy-duty, tried and true way to get your Drupal site running. You can do a custom local installation if you want to get in the weeds and deal with potentially more issues. In exchange, you get a faster running website on your computer. You could also use MAMP, WAMP, or XAMPP. These are all applications. They're not words I made up. MAMP stands for Mac, Apache, MySQL, PHP, although in newer versions of MAMP, it actually is available for Windows as well. So this option is what we're going to use today. We're actually going to use MAMP today. I never use this option when working on a Drupal site. However, this option is sort of a one-click installer. It makes it very easy and fast to install PHP directly on your computer. The reason I do not use it for Drupal is because it's less flexible. but I don't really need that flexibility today. There's Acquia Dev Desktop. This one is, it was a very good option for Drupal. It no longer is. I believe Acquia is moving away from it as well. So I would not start a new project with Dev Desktop. And finally, there are Docker-based solutions. It's somewhat similar to VirtualBox as far as we are concerned today. It works fairly well. It can be a little bit slow depending on which computer you are using. And finally, the other option is to not to install Drupal on your computer at all, but to instead have this installed online on a web host. Okay, so again, this is not the main focus for today, but it is a prerequisite for running PHP applications, especially Drupal. At Debug Academy, we prefer to use DDEV, which is sort of a wrapper which facilitates Docker usage. There are alternatives to DDEV which are somewhat similar, such as Lando and Docsol. Yes, I prefer using DDEV specifically for Drupal projects. On certain machines, when Docker does not work very well, I prefer to use DrupalVM.com, which is VirtualBox based. I have actually found that it performs better on Macs than DDEV does. Over time, I expect Docker's performance to continue to change. That's Docker, not Stalker, which the caption filled in. And finally, remote development, if your computer cannot handle any of these options, is what I would use for Drupal development. Okay. I'm going to switch presentations here to the PHP one. Okay, now that we understand we need to have a development environment running to run Drupal and also to run PHP, let's talk about PHP itself. In this presentation, I'm making the assumption that a number of people have not written code before. So I'm making the assumption that not only is PHP new, but JavaScript may also be new to you. Java may also be new, and so on. You may have some experience with HTML and CSS, but I'm making the assumption that you do not have experience with other programming languages. And as part of that, or to support that level of knowledge, we're going to talk about what it means to code and to program in general. So programming languages, such as PHP, are somewhat similar to natural languages. There are a couple of differences, though. Programming languages possess a very limited vocabulary, so words like "so" are not going to be part of your programming language. Programming languages are very explicit, and the third bullet, which is very closely tied to the second, programming languages never imply anything. There's nothing to be implied. Everything must be stated explicitly in your programming script. And that takes a lot of getting used to when you're starting out. One more difference. When you are using a natural language, like English or Arabic or so on, you typically are going off of memory. But when you're using a programming language, you would be more likely to be Googling as you write. Google or your preferred search engine. So with programming languages, there's a limited vocabulary and you have access to the internet while you're using the language. Programmers are people who translate ideas to one of these more limited programming languages. So there's a question in chat, will this presentation be available afterwards? The video recording will be posted to the YouTube account. If you'd like access to the presentation itself, you'll need to register for free on debugacademy.com. If you register there, then I can grant you access to this presentation. And your colleagues could also register on our website, even if they did not attend here. So thinking about programming languages in general, HTML, let's take this as an example. HTML is one of the simpler programming languages. Its vocabulary consists of elements on a page. So for example, a web page might have a table, and there is a table element, a table piece of code for creating that table. You may have a form. There are HTML elements corresponding to the form you're creating. So the HTML language has a vocabulary which consists of elements on the page. I promise I'm going somewhere with this. Now, who understands HTML? Aside from the people typing it, when you write HTML, it's meant to be understood by web browsers. So that means Google Chrome, Firefox, Safari, Internet Explorer, and so on. They read the HTML and they use that information to build a web page, to present a web page. So at the end of the day, most websites you visit, they are showing you the results of HTML being displayed on the page. HTML is a markup language, that's correct, and it can work alongside other languages. So when you write PHP, one of the outputs of your PHP is typically going to be HTML. So you can write your HTML code, and your HTML code is read by your browser, and that's one of the key takeaways here. Google Chrome, Firefox, etc. read the HTML, and they build your web page. However, notice I wrote that it's understood by web browsers like Firefox, but it does not understand anything. And what I mean by that is HTML is a one-way conversation. Your browser is not going to send information back to your HTML, but rather your HTML will be given to your browser and your browser will generate a page. CSS is another language. Its vocabulary consists of styling rules, including positioning and visibility. CSS is also understood by web browsers, meaning I can write a bunch of CSS code and my web browser, such as Firefox and Google Chrome, will interpret that code and apply the styling. It also is a two-way conversation. CSS understands the users of the web browser. So what does that mean? That means if I am a visitor on the website and I hover my mouse over a link, the link might change color. Right? Sometimes you hover over a link and the underline appears or the text becomes bold. And that's what I mean by a two-way conversation. Your browser reads the CSS, but upon moving my mouse around the page, the CSS code might react to what the user is doing. So we can have CSS code that specifically is written to react to user interactions. And finally, that's all meant to get us to PHP. And let me make one more point before I switch gears to PHP. When I say CSS is understood by web browsers, again, I mean Firefox, Google Chrome, Internet Explorer, Safari, etc. And the important takeaway there is each one of those different browsers can interpret the language however it chooses to. So I can write some CSS, it could work on Google Chrome, and it might not work on a different browser. So you have to test your CSS on multiple browsers. And think of this sort of like normal or natural languages. If I speak to one person and I give them some tough feedback, and then I give somebody else same tough feedback delivered in exactly the same way, depending on who I'm talking to, I might get different results. One person might say, "Thank you, I appreciate the honesty." The other person might be offended and they might get their feelings hurt by being too forward. So even though I'm saying exactly the same thing, if I say it to different people, I can get a different result. And HTML and CSS are the same. You can say the same thing, but when you say it to different browsers, it's up to them, up to the browsers, how they interpret it. Now, PHP is a more capable programming language. It can do more. Its vocabulary is much more expansive. It consists of interacting with data. It can talk to the server. It runs one line at a time. It has the ability to group code and make the code reusable. After running PHP code, some output is typically generated, and that output is given back to the user. And it has many built-in functions. PHP is not understood by the browser. PHP is understood by the web server, and that's completely different. That means if I take PHP code and I give it to Firefox, Firefox will not know what to do with it. I would have to give PHP to Docker or to VirtualBox or to a remote development environment or something like that. They are the ones who would interpret the PHP code. So when someone comes and visits my Drupal site and they use Google Chrome to do so, they are not interpreting PHP code themselves. Google Chrome is not interpreting PHP code. There's a step before that. The web server, Docker, for example, is the one that's reading the PHP code and interpreting it. And after Docker finishes understanding the PHP code, it runs the PHP code and it receives the output. The output is typically HTML, CSS, and JavaScript. So PHP runs on the server, and then it generates HTML, CSS, JavaScript, and it sends those to the browser. It sends those to Google Chrome or Firefox or whatnot. And there are some upsides to this dynamic. The fact that PHP is not understood by different browsers means when you write PHP code, you do not have to do cross-browser testing. Your PHP code is only going to be run on your server, such as Docker. It will not be run on the browsers of your visitors. So you just make sure your PHP code works on your site, and you can be confident that it then is going to work for all of your visitors as well. PHP is also a two-way conversation. it is understood by web servers and it understands web servers as well. That means PHP code can be interpreted by a web server. It also means that PHP code can talk to the web server. It can extract information from the web server. So PHP can go to the web server and say, hey, what time is it for the person who's currently visiting my website? Or, what's the IP address of the person currently visiting the website? Or what does the URL say right now? So all of that is information that the server has, and because PHP has the ability to talk to the server in a two-way conversation, PHP can get that information from the server. So when you're writing code, it's always a good idea to think, what information does my code need to run? And using that, you can look at the language PHP and see who PHP talks to, and you can decide if what you're trying to do is even possible in that language. Is there a good reference for distinctions between PHP and its capabilities and .NET with its capabilities? I am not familiar with one that directly pits them against each other. We do have a PHP ramp-up course, which is 4 classes. Each class is an hour and a half long. And in those classes, we try to cover a lot of PHP's capabilities, which likely would give you a lot of what you're looking for. What we're covering today is part of the first day of those 4 classes. But each class sort of moves at a different level, where we talk, for example, about PHP object-oriented programming in one of those classes, and we talk about the magic methods and interacting with user data on the server in another one of the classes. But no, I don't know of a direct comparison between those two, unfortunately. Let's see, so PHP has what are called magic methods. They are essentially functions or variable names which give you access to some information on the server. So again, like the time zone of the person currently visiting, the URL which they visited, and more. Okay. Now, when I say that PHP is somewhat similar to a natural language, sometimes people think, are we just doing what Google Translate does? And the answer is not quite. And it's because people can infer and read between the lines, whereas computers read only the lines that are written. So a programmer's job is to comprehensively translate tasks using a limited vocabulary in a language that is unnatural to humans. And that's why it's sometimes challenging to learn your first programming language. So this is not meant to discourage you, but rather, if some of what you hear today seems out of reach, realize that it's not you that's the problem. It's the fact that this is not something that this is not in line with our typical way of thinking. So it takes getting used to. So now let's jump into the language itself, into the syntax and what can be done. You can just disregard the start your server here. But PHP is a server-side language, meaning it's a language which is interpreted by the server, not by the browser. And PHP generates a response and gives the response, which could also be thought of as the output. It gives the response to whoever is visiting your page. That response usually consists of HTML, CSS, and JavaScript. And if you're curious about this on the right, What this is how you would create a PHP environment if you had Docker and ddev installed on your computer. Again, I mentioned today I would be using MAMP. I'll show you MAMP momentarily, but MAMP is an application you can download, which is a little easier to use because you would not need to use the command line. What you're seeing on the right here, this is part of the 3-month course when we do some PHP practice outside of the context of Drupal. So this is all that it takes to start a Docker environment using PHP. Okay, so this is the PHP language. This is what it looks like. Typically, actions in PHP end with a semicolon. The most common issue in PHP is people forget to write the semicolon. So you can see setting a value. For example, if we create a variable, if we create a named piece of data, we could store a value in that name. So we can set the value 5. We can store it inside of the variable named count. And we need to put that semicolon at the end because we're performing an action. We could also print material. So you could print the word hi, and again, you need to put a semicolon at the end to denote that you're taking an action. There is an exception. If you're using curly braces around some block of code, then typically you would not put a semicolon after the curly braces. Variable names, and again, this is the ability to create a name and to store a value in that name. Those always start with a $sign in PHP. So $, today's date equals, and you could put a date on the right. You could also use math to compute a value. So here we can see the variable named area. We're setting it equal to the variable width times the variable height. So for all we know, width could contain the number 5, height could contain the number 4, in which case the area would become 20. When you write PHP code in a .php file, you need to wrap your PHP code in opening and closing PHP tags. So that opening PHP tag is what you see here. It's less than $PHP, and then the closing tag is $greater than. Anything in between those two will be treated as PHP code. Anything outside of those two will just get treated like HTML. If you want to leave notes for yourself in your code, you can do so using comments. 2 slashes is a single line comment. A $sign is also a single line comment. What that means is if you were to type 2 slashes and put them at the beginning of a sentence, PHP would ignore that sentence. If you type a $sign and put it at the beginning of a sentence, PHP would ignore that sentence. You can also have PHP ignore multiple lines by typing /* and then */. Anything in between those 2 asterisks will also be ignored. Okay, so this is just a look at some of the syntax. Syntax refers to the way you type the code. All right, now in PHP, how could I generate a web page? How does Drupal generate a web page? It seems very simple, but in PHP, we print HTML typically. So we can use the print command, and then we can print out whatever content we want. So this could be an H1 with the name of our website in between the opening and closing H1 tags. Echo is practically the same as print. In Drupal, though, they use print. So if you're working in Drupal, you can ignore the echo command and you can go straight to print. Good question. So you said, why was May 10th in between two quotation marks, but the number 5 was not in between two quotation marks? We have a slide coming up on that, but it's due to the types of each one. You put words in between quotation marks, and if you put, I should say, if you put anything in between quotation marks, it's treated like a word. If we put the number 5 in between quotation marks, it would have been treated like the word, or like a word which contained the number 5 as part of the word. Without quotation marks, it's treated like a number. And with numbers, you can do math and have more expected results, whereas when you do math on words, it may or may not behave a little differently. Now, I mentioned that print and echo are used for displaying content. var dump is used for debugging content. So that means if you have the number 5 and you're not sure if it had quotation marks around it or not, you could use var dump to display the number 5 and also to display some information about that piece of data. So var dump is good for you to investigate your content and see some information about it. So if you wanted to create a very simple page in PHP, you could create a file whose name ends in .php. And you could write the print statement and open up a quotation mark. And in between the opening and closing quotation marks, you can write whatever HTML you like. Okay, so I'm going to go ahead and do this example. I'm going to create a PHP page, which is very, very basic, and I will just print out an H1 and a paragraph, and we'll see a little bit of PHP in action. I might not have captions for this portion, but that is the summary of what I'm going to do. I'm just going to put in H1 and a paragraph tag. So I'm going to open up a text editor. Okay. All right, this is a .php file. Everything in the file is treated as HTML except for what's in between opening and closing PHP tags. This is treated as PHP, not HTML. That's why the color changed. This is treated as HTML again because it's outside of the PHP tags. So if you're getting confused with PHP, HTML, CSS, and JavaScript. Okay. Let me create this page and see if I can clear that up a bit. the closing PHP tag is not necessary if the whole page is PHP. Two slashes is a one-line comment. Okay, now I'm going to print out the web page. So I'm going to print out, and I have to put a semicolon at the end. So let's look at the page. You can see this PHP code up top generated this page on the bottom. If I look at the page as HTML using the browser's inspector tool, you'll see the PHP code is gone. Okay. So you see that just HTML, body, H1, paragraph, body, HTML. There's no PHP, there's no print. The browser, Firefox in this case, does not know it was a PHP page, or it is a PHP page. It only sees the output of the page. In this case, the HTML. Okay, let me bring the presentation back. Okay. And let me check the chat here. Okay, so there's a question about HTML, CSS, JavaScript, and PHP. HTML is the structure for the page's content. Put differently, HTML renders the page's content. CSS styles the page's content. CSS can be used to move some text to the left, to make it big, to make it a different color, and so on. JavaScript is used for more advanced interactions between the browser and the user. If I want something fancy to happen when the user scrolls, for example, I want the scroll to fast forward down the page or some other fancy effect to happen, JavaScript can do that. JavaScript can do quite a bit, but essentially JavaScript can be used to trigger functionality or advanced display logic from the browser. What makes PHP different is that PHP does not talk to the browser, and the browser does not talk to PHP. Whereas JavaScript is actually given to the browser. So when we talk security, JavaScript code is code that could be run directly on the user's browser, and the user technically can run JavaScript that they write on your website, because JavaScript is run at the user's browser level. PHP, on the other hand, is run before the page is given to the user, and it's only run directly on the server. PHP is something that the visitor to your website cannot run themselves. They cannot write their own custom PHP and run something. And because of which, people will sometimes use PHP to perform the more secure interactions like authentication or interacting with the database, running queries to extract data from the database, and so on. Whereas JavaScript they might use for display logic or advanced display logic. So yes, PHP is only server side. HTML, CSS, and JavaScript are all browser side. Yes, that's correct. It is possible to run JavaScript on the server. That's a newer invention, you could say. But PHP has always run on the server, and it can only run on the server. In PHP, you're not just going to print a web page right away. You typically are going to perform a lot more logic and then use the output of all of that logic to assemble a page. And in PHP, one of the ways you do that is by creating a function. A function is a block of code. It's a collection of PHP code, which is named. And I like to think of a function as a tool, because you can use it as many times as you want. You also have the freedom not to use it. So when for example, I have a rake, and I could use that on my leaves, but just the fact that I have the rake does not does not mean that my leaves are going to get cleaned up, right? It's a tool. I have to actually go out, call upon it, and use it. With functions, it's the same. You can create a function, and creating a function doesn't mean that you've done anything. You have to actually use the function for it to have an effect. This is what a function looks like. You type the word function, you choose a name for your function, and if your function needs additional information, you provide it with the additional information. Okay, and when you do that, the code in between these curly braces is what runs whenever this function is called upon. So that was for the creation of a function. But like I said, you want the ability to use the function, and this is how you would use the function. You would type that name that you created for your function, and you may pass it information in between the parentheses. And using a function is considered to be an action, actions, and in semicolons. Okay. I'm going to go ahead and create a function and then use it in our script, and let's see what that looks like. I'm creating a function which adds two numbers together. And it's going to also print the result. So I created a function which adds two numbers and prints the result. But like I said, creating a function does not do anything. After creating it, you still need to call or invoke the function. So I'll first refresh the page to show it doesn't do anything yet. Refresh, nothing is different. Okay. Now I'll call on the function. This function accepts two numbers, number 1 and number 2. And I'm giving it two numbers, 119 and 1. The first number I give it will get stored in the first position. The second number I give it will get stored in the second position. Okay, the two values I specify here will be given to the two values in the function definition. And because I put the semicolon and the function name, it's going to call on that function. You see 119 plus 1 is 120. Right. I'm also going to print a line break. Okay, and then I can just show you a couple of options. 5 plus 5, that number plus that number, 9 plus 19, and let's change this. Number 1 plus number 2 equals sum. So we are running out of time. We're just about out of time. So I'll leave it here. If you'd like to continue learning about PHP, we have a PHP Ramp Up course, which covers about 4 times this amount of material and is interactive. If you'd like to learn about Drupal, we have a 3-month part-time course We have 1-day advanced module course, and we have 1-day intro site building course. And a lot more. Check out debugacademy.com, register for access to today's PowerPoint and to hear about future courses. Let me see.
Thank you, Asha.
Of course, thank you. I was just going to give you all the link to register, which is right here. Okay, that's all I have for today. Thank you all. I appreciate you sitting through this with me. I am the lead teacher for all of our courses. Again, our courses are hands-on. Our courses are hands-on. Maybe I should say our paid courses are hands-on, and I'm the lead teacher for the majority of our courses. We're also available for consulting and development work. Please get in touch. I would say from our side, with Corona, we've definitely seen a downturn in, of course, in-person trainings, which we're not doing right now. So, you know, we would love to help you out on your project, and we appreciate any leads and any support that you all could give with our online trainings as well. Yes, for sure, Kristen. All right, thank you all. I'll stop talking now and let you take it away.
All right. Thank you, everybody, for attending. Keep in mind, December, our presentation webinar will be on GitLab and the Drupal Association. And so everybody, happy Thanksgiving, happy holidays, stay safe, and I hope to see you next month.
Thank
Bye,
you.
everybody.